have come in a report tabled to the government from a group of epidemiologists led by Sir David Skegg, who joins me now. Hello.
Hello, Brady.
So what were you asked to do and what have you found?
Well, by the way, we're not all epidemiologists. We're a group of scientists and doctors. And what we're asked to do is to give advice to the government on a number of questions that will inform their policy about when we can open the borders and how. So that's not over to us. It's obviously a political decision, but the government are keen to get scientific advice, and we're trying to answer their questions.
So there are just 3 reports that have come out, and so how did the Delta variant change your views to sort of see that flowing through the report about the best way forward?
Yeah, well, I think people who read the 3 reports, they're basically 3 responses to government, and there'll be more over the coming months. This is an iterative process. But you probably would notice a change of tone over the weeks, and that's because as we learnt more about the Delta variant, we just realised that this is just so much more difficult to control. So it's much more challenging than it would have been last year.
So the report talks about sticking with the elimination strategy, albeit maybe changing its name. But can you explain a little bit about what New Zealand would look like if we stopped following the elimination strategy? The report touches on, impacts on the health system, but Well,
first of all, elimination's a confusing term. As used by epidemiologists, it doesn't mean eradication. It doesn't necessarily mean zero COVID, but it does mean stamping out clusters of infection whenever they arise. If we weren't able to continue that, then the infection would become endemic in New Zealand. We would have a lot of hospital admissions and deaths, and I think our society would change in the way it has in other countries. If you take the UK, for example, although they think they're doing a bit better now, they've had about 150,000 deaths, they've still got about 100 deaths a day, and people are having to mainly work at home. The number of social contacts that people have is down to about a quarter of what it was before the pandemic. People wear masks for about 90% of the time outside the house. So, it is a different kind of life, and I'm very keen that we should do our best to maintain what we've got here.
Yeah, absolutely. The report also says, quote, New Zealand is liable to experience an outbreak similar to that in New South Wales over the coming months. Can you explain why? Yeah.
By the way, we did say liable, not likely, but because some people have, I think, perhaps overinterpreted that. Yeah. I'm just sort of warning people that, the Delta virus is in New Zealand now. It's in 2 hospitals. It's an MIQ. We've got to be vigilant all the time. I don't think we should assume that we're immune to this, because we're certainly not. We've seen most states in Australia have outbreaks recently, and we can't be complacent. But what I would hope is that if we do have an outbreak, I'm sure our government would act a lot more quickly than the New South Wales government did. They delayed the lockdown. It's never been a really hard lockdown. And, 356 cases yesterday again. They've been in lockdown now this is the 7th week, and about 70 people in intensive care. So I think it's very important that in New Zealand we are aware that as a partially vaccinated population, we're still very vulnerable.
Yeah. And can you explain a bit how things might change at the border and in MIQ once the vaccine rollout is complete? Who would be allowed to enter New Zealand?
Well, the first thing to say is we don't decide that. The government has to decide that. And obviously no one can spell out all the details of where we'll be in a year's time. But what we're expecting is that when the vaccination rollout is completed, so at the beginning of next year, we would expect that there would be a phased reopening of the border. And we're recommending that the first group should be New Zealanders who we know are fully vaccinated with the Pfizer vaccine, who go overseas, not to the highest risk countries, but to lower risk countries, and come back after a short trip. We think they would be the ideal group to start the new process with the various precautions we've outlined.
Yeah. Okay. The report also talks about the degree of community protection will be increased if eligibility for vaccinations extended to people between 12 and 16, so sort of children. How important is it that kids are included in the vaccine rollout, and when do you think that would need to happen?
Well, the higher the proportion of people vaccinated, the more options we've got. And the committee has noted that if we could vaccinate teenagers, that would increase our protection. But there's a lot of considerations to be made there, and it's not our group's decision to make. But that's something which is being looked at actively.
Yeah, because kids are about a quarter of the population, or young people.
Yep, and many countries are vaccinating teenagers now, and some, including the US, are looking at younger children as well.
Yeah. And can you sort of explain why we will never reach herd immunity and there's sort of no magic number?
Well, yeah, unfortunately, because this virus is so transmissible, it's much more transmissible than most of the infections we deal with, like influenza or the common cold. It's about the same as chickenpox. It's very infectious. And it turns out that modelling shows that even when you get up above 90% vaccination, you won't cross what we call the herd immunity threshold, which is where an infection would actually not transmit from one to another person, wouldn't spread because there's enough immunity in the population. So we'll never be able to abandon all the other precautions like testing and contact tracing and things like that.
Yeah, okay. And just lastly, so the government's going to respond to some of your advice tomorrow. What is next for your group? Well,
our group will continue to, I'm sure, we'll be given questions from the government, and it's a changing situation, it's dynamic. So we're expecting to continue this dialogue over the coming months.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.